The government of China may be led by the Communist Party, but the aspirations of ordinary Chinese people seem to be anything but socialist. They're buying property, cars, electronics, and stocks as never before. As China grows, so does its global footprint. How is the rest of the world, particularly the United States, dealing with the continuing trade imbalance, with the quality of Chinese products, and with China's ever-growing thirst for energy? As Chinese and U.S. companies go head-to-head in the world of business, technology, and manufacturing, who's got the edge? We'll look at these and other questions next on Great Decisions.
In a democracy, agreement is not essential, but participation is. Join us as we discuss today's most critical global issues. Join us for Great Decisions. Great Decisions is produced by the Foreign Policy Association, inspiring Americans to learn more about the world.
Funding for Great Decisions is provided by the Star Foundation and U.S. Trust.
It was among the most highly orchestrated visits by a foreign leader to the United States in recent memory. When newly appointed Chinese President Hu Jintao came in April of 2006, his first stop was not Washington, D.C., but the West Coast, where he visited Microsoft and Boeing, businesses with strong presences in China. He even told Bill Gates he uses Microsoft software every day. It is perhaps not surprising that President Hu chose to meet with the richest man in the world before meeting with the leader of the free world. When Hu finally did make it to Washington, his was not to be an official state visit. There would be no black-tie state dinner. The U.S. administration considered it a working visit. He got a luncheon. Some considered that a snub. It could have demonstrated the U.S.'s dissatisfaction with China's human rights record, and maybe it was a way to pressure China to make economic concessions. Whatever it meant, the drama was characteristic of a complicated relationship. China and the United States are at the same time at odds and interdependent. There's a huge trade imbalance between the U.S. and China, maintained at least in part through tight state controls of Chinese currency values. While Chinese people simply can't afford to buy many imported goods, many Americans can't afford not to buy products made in China.
Some people say the real situation is closer to the codependency relationship between a drug dealer and an addict. The United States is the addict.
At the end of 2007, China was America's fastest-growing trading partner. China's economy is growing at an unprecedented rate, 11% in 2006. And China is poised to take over Germany as the world's third largest economy behind the U.S. and Japan. Much of this is because so many businesses operate within China. A cheap and well-educated workforce is very attractive to Western businesses. But as China's economy grows, so does its thirst for energy. 20 years ago, China was the biggest oil exporter in East Asia. These days, it is the second largest importer of oil in the world. Given the U.S.'s own thirst for energy, that kind of competition with China makes Washington a little uncomfortable. While the economic floodgates may well have opened, not all of China is reaping the benefits. There is still extreme poverty in China, particularly outside the big cities, and it's getting worse as more of the economy becomes centralized in urban areas. And the Communist Party still maintains strict control over the government and the dissemination of information. Emails, internet access, news in general are all tightly controlled. And any group seen as subversive or even merely dissident is prosecuted, intimidated, or banned outright. None of this endears China to the United States, nor does China's support of regimes in Sudan and North Korea. Where do Sino-American relations go from here? Is it possible for the United States to reap the benefits of an economic relationship with China while at the same time pushing Beijing to adopt more liberal social values? Is that even a priority for the U.S.? And what about energy? Does China's growing appetite pose a real threat to the U.S.? U.S.-China trade, out of balance. Next on Great Decisions.
And now from our New York studios, here is Ralph Begleiter.
Welcome to Great Decisions. Joining us to help understand the trade relationship between China and the United States are Carla Hills, former U.S. trade representative during the Bush Senior administration. She's now the co-chairman of the Council on Foreign Relations. And David Lampton, longtime China scholar, now Dean of the Faculty and Director of Chinese Studies at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
How big is the relationship in trade between China and the United States? Carla?
It's big. It's growing. It's our fastest growing export market. It's growing about 160% a year in the last 5 years, where our overall exports are growing about 10 to 12%. So it's a big relationship and an important one.
Our biggest trade partner?
No, not our biggest trade partner, but our fastest growing trading partner.
Where does it fit in the panoply of trading partners the United States has?
It's about our third largest.
We've been talking about China as a land of trade opportunity for decades now, but it seems as though really only in about the last 10 years or so have American companies, and companies from other countries for that matter, been able to really take root and begin to have a flourishing trade relationship in China. What's happened in those last few years? David?
Well, basically, China has changed, starting in 1978, its policy to welcome foreign direct investment. And indeed, China is probably the most welcoming of foreign direct investment of any country in Asia and maybe any developing country in the world. And China has cheap labor, getting more expensive all the time, but nonetheless, there are comparative advantages there. And American companies, and companies from Germany and Europe, elsewhere in Europe and around the world, are relocating production capacity there. And so when we see the label and all the goods we buy made in China, that's really a misnomer. It's really assembled in China. And many of the components that go into those assembled goods are made in our other friendly countries, such as Japan and Republic of Korea, throughout Southeast Asia. And one thing that makes it very difficult for the United States when it has a trade deficit with China is if we seek retaliation against China, we're in fact retaliating on all our friends who are exporting to China, where the goods are assembled and then shipped off to the United States. So China's just sort of the last stage in a very complicated chain of production in the world today.
We'll come back to the retaliation question in a bit. Carla, when David says China's been welcoming to direct investment, what do you mean by welcoming? They've always wanted people to invest there. There's always been a fear, though, that you won't get your money out if you invest there. Hasn't that been
the market is wide open in China. It is their ratio of trade to their gross domestic product, GDP, is much higher than our own. And their effective tariff is below 10%. So it is a very open market, a welcoming market to inward investment. And that accounts for tremendous change that has taken place since 1990. Our trade with China in 1990 was non-consequential. And our deficit with East Asia was commanded by Japan. Today, our deficit with East Asia is a little bit less than it was in 1990, but China has gobbled up the major portion. So it is displaced Japan, South Korea, Singapore, and Taiwan as those with whom we're doing trade. And David is absolutely right. It is the assembly plant for the world.
I wanted to say also this dimension of welcomingness isn't just foreign investment in China. China's GDP, 30% of its GDP is in imports. Much of the export production that China is sending to the world is made by machines that are bought in the United States, in Germany, from Japan, and so forth. So China is also not only open to foreign direct investment, but contrary to public perception, it's also extremely open to imports, far more open than Japan has ever been.
We talked at Great Decisions with Nicholas Lardy, who's a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Let's hear what he says about China's open or closed market.
I think many people have the impression that this is a relatively closed economy, and that's why they have such a big trade surplus, not only with the United States, but globally. The reality is more complex. They're pretty open on the import side. Yes, their currency is undervalued, but the reason they have such a large surplus is the tremendous growth of their exports. But their imports are also growing at a very, very rapid rate as well. So it has been our fastest growing large export market for more than a decade. Our exports to China are growing much more rapidly than any other country. And I think many people have the idea that the deficit that we have in our trade with China is a result of the fact that their market is fairly closed, and that's simply not the case.
Let's follow up on that a bit, because I think you made some interesting points there. Americans see made in China in their underwear and their socks and a lot of other things. And you're not saying that China is importing a lot of American agricultural goods or other American products of that sort. You're saying that China is importing other kinds of things, finished machinery and computers and technology is, I guess, what they're importing. Is that something that maybe Americans don't see, that kind of trade?
Well, because they're importing intermediary goods that are combined with other goods for the final product, you do not see them. And that is what makes China an assembly platform for the world, particularly in the manufactured sector. And so if you go into a Walmart, a child's car seat, underwear and socks, as you say, shirts, sweaters, it's all made in China. It's very, very visible. But if you buy a laptop, you do not see the component parts of it. You don't see the threads that went into the sweater. You don't see the various things that have come from outside China's borders.
But I want to also say agriculture is a very big part of this trade relationship. It's not just the manufactured components going from the United States or other more advanced economies. It's also agricultural and commodities of all sorts going to China from the United States. I, not long ago, was in Oklahoma and more recently Montana. These are all states that have a huge stake in trade with China. You go to Washington State and they'll talk to you about apples and exports to China. And so now there are problems with apple juice. It gets very complicated. But the agricultural sector sees a big stake. Now, it also, we should say, there are problems here. And when we say China's open, agricultural people will tell you, well, yes, but they have phytosanitary standards for the import, cleanliness of goods and contamination and so on. And the Chinese have from time to time used those standards to keep goods out. So it's not a perfect picture here. But if you talk to American agriculture, you're going to find people who want a more open and a freer trade circumstance with China, not a closed view.
Carl, I want to follow up with your point about being the manufacturing plant, and really both of you made this point. Has the United States, in effect, turned over responsibility for manufacturing the things the United States needs to China and perhaps some other countries as well? And is that a potential danger in the future, to not being able to put together our own stuff?
Not at all. Actually, we are manufacturing and our output is 20% higher than it was a half a decade ago, with 30% fewer workers. That's affecting manufacturing globally because manufacturing has adopted technological change. Technology is changing manufacturing. China is on the lower end of the manufacturing staircase. We're at the upper end, and we work very, very well together. So I'd like to also say on the agricultural part, this is not only a big market, but a growing market, because China is water short, and its arable land does not meet the needs of its people. So it is going to have to permit more and more agricultural goods to come in, and we have a complementarity there that is very valuable to both sides.
I just should say, too, on this staircase notion that we're at the upper end of the staircase in the Chinese technologically. That's true. It's important. Our productivity as a nation's gone up dramatically. But there is a but, and that is China is dumping more money into research and development. Multinationals are dumping in research centers very rapidly into China. And China's moving up that staircase. And if you think not only of China but India, we have 40% of the world's smart intelligence people coming online, and they're moving up that value-added chain. So I've always felt that reform in China and change in China is going to require us to keep moving up that staircase. And we have to start asking what we're doing in education and so on that'll keep us moving up. So this is not a static situation.
Well, you mentioned that China is importing machinery and computers and other kinds of technology from us. They're going to start building their own at some point, even if it's only to copy the work that the United States has already done. I'm not sure where we go from there. Maybe that's looking too far down the road.
We should be very careful about being fearful of competition. We're an innovative people, but we've got to be competitive. And if 40% of our high school students fail to graduate, we have a big problem that we cannot blame on China. We have to keep up with the competitiveness in the world. We can, but we can't blame our shortcomings on another country. A decade and a half ago, we were blaming Japan. Today, we're blaming China. And we've got to stop doing that and begin to look a little bit inward and pull ourselves up by our socks.
All of us, I think, remember the days when the phrase made in Japan referred to shoddy goods. And today, I think there's a lot of that impression or that imagery about Chinese goods as well. There have been a number of scandals over the last year or so involving poor quality goods coming from China to the United States and elsewhere. The Chinese seem to be very eager to deal with those issues, and they're not resistant, it seems, to the criticism. They actually take on board the criticism and have improved or are attempting to improve their procedures. That seems to be a change in China's kind of attitude as well toward the United States, isn't it?
I think it is a positive change in their attitude. They've had problems with toys and toothpaste and tires and seafood. And at the recent, at the fall Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation meeting that was held in Australia and hosted by Australia, China and Australia were named to chair a committee of the 21 economies that make up what we call APEC, to set international standards and bring the members of APEC up to those international standards for food products and manufacturing products. And China was right in there, trying to see that its products would meet international standards.
And I think as we don't sort of absolve China of responsibility in this product quality issue that we now face, we have to recognize that multinational firms have been pushing down costs of production in China. There's a very complicated set of contractors in China. And American firms have a responsibility to make sure that their designs are good, that those standards are implemented in China. And the United States government has an obligation to, at least to the degree feasible, make sure the products that are coming into the United States meet our standards. So I think this is a problem that represents globalization. The Chinese have lots of responsibility, our multinationals have lots of responsibility, and frankly, the federal government does as well.
You know, the business of quality of Chinese goods has brought China trade back to the forefront here in the United States again, and Americans tend to respond angrily when they think that somebody else is dumping poor quality stuff on American children, for example, in the form of toys or children's equipment. What would happen if in the United States the American people demanded of members of Congress that the U.S. take some political action against China to sort of say, well, we're not going to buy that stuff anymore from China? What would happen to the U.S. economy if such a thing were to occur? Could it occur, for that matter? I don't know, David?
Well, I not too long ago went to China with 2 members of Congress, and this was a heavy item on the discussion with Chinese leaders. And the long and the short of it is that Congress, I think for the most part, recognizes that we have mutual interests in this relationship. I think there will be legislation in the future that deals with this quality of export issue. Part of the solution may be stationing some people from our consumer product safety bureaucracy in China. Some will be imposing legislation on companies to assure quality with penalties if it's not met. I think there will be legislative result of this, but it's not going to threaten the relationship. And ultimately, I've had Chinese tell me we are grateful for the U.S. Anything it can do can push up standards of production in China, because in fact we suffer from the same production deficiencies that you Americans are complaining about.
David's point's very well taken, because most of U.S. products that are made in China are sold in China. And Chinese complain bitterly when the standards are not met. When we import products, Very often they are foreign companies, as we've already mentioned, and it is their responsibility to be assured that their name is not blemished because they brought a product into a country like the United States and it doesn't meet U.S. standards. We have to be very careful that we don't apply a different level of standard to imports than we apply to our products made at home.
One of the things we haven't touched on so far in this conversation, and I know, Carla, you were intensely involved in at the time you were in government, was the issue of intellectual property protection. That's still an area of great dispute between China and the United States, and it's a whole industry here in the United States, and for that matter elsewhere, of people who are concerned about stealing of movies and music and computer design and software and that sort of thing. Have we made progress in the relationship along those lines?
We've made progress. Keep in mind that China didn't have intellectual property laws in the early 1990s. They now have the laws, and our complaint and the friction is because of the enforcement of the laws. I think that the Chinese government tries to have good enforcement, but the provinces and the localities find that they can get profit from not abiding by those laws. It's a problem that we have globally, and we do have a considerable amount of friction from the failure to enforce intellectual property laws.
Would you care to offer a prediction on that score? Is that problem going to be solved by essentially abandonment or partial abandonment of the rights of intellectual property owners, or is it going to be solved by everybody respecting those rights in the end? David?
Well, I think it's going to be solved by the development of China, as we've seen in the Republic of Korea, in Taiwan, throughout Asia. At the beginning of industrialization and manufacturing production, you tend to copy what's available rather than innovate. But as China develops its own middle class and entrepreneurs and people who have a stake in Chinese intellectual property, we're going to find people on the inside in China, these entrepreneurs themselves demanding protection of their intellectual property as well as the intellectual property that they may have purchased from abroad, including the United States. So I don't think China is going to just simply through legislation solve the problem. Chinese society has to change and a class of entrepreneurs develop.
There's another economy in the world that is as large, perhaps larger than that of the United States, and that's the European Union's economy. Some people have suggested that the relationship between China and the United States is in some way a competitive one to the way China relates to the European Union. Americans have complained that the Europeans are doing things with China that undercut the U.S. interest and so on. Great Decisions spoke with John Bruton, who's the European Union's ambassador to the United States, about this issue of EU versus U.S. And its relationship with China. Let's hear what he has to say.
I don't think that there will be any impact of a negative kind from our relationship with China on the United States' relationship with China. We, the United States and the European Union, have pretty much the same agenda. We want intellectual property protection, safety for our goods. We want a more balanced trading relationship. We want to ensure that energy supplies are not unduly disrupted by anything China might do, or that we might do for that matter. So, we have a very similar agenda, and I think we need to concert with one another in the messages we give to China. I don't think that there's any potential problem there as such.
Perhaps a final word. Do you see a growing competition with the EU in this area, or do you think that John Bruton is right, that this is something that will not present a problem between the U.S. and its European partners, friends?
In this globalized world, it's so important that we sit down and not only have bilateral conversations, but have plurilateral conversations. We worry about the currency being undervalued in China. We should have at the table Europe, China, Japan, the United States, to talk about how we correct the imbalance, and whether it is the strategic interests in Northeast Asia, or whether it is the strategic interests in and around Iraq with respect to Iran. I don't think that we can adequately come to a final solution without dealing with persons who have different kinds of interests and can affect different kinds of reactions. So meeting with the fastest growing economy in the world, Europe, China is the fastest growing economy in the world, Europe, Japan, and the United States on some of the issues that you've raised today would be enormously helpful. We will be working with China in the future. It's to our advantage to do so, and we want that relationship to be harmonious and productive.
David Lampton, China scholar, director of Chinese Studies at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and the dean of the faculty. Carla Hills, former U.S. trade representative during the Bush Senior administration and co-chairman of the Council on Foreign Relations. Thank you very, very much, both of you, for being with us on Great Decisions.
Good to be with you.
And thank you as well for being with us on Great Decisions. I'm Ralph Begleiter.
To learn more about topics discussed on Great Decisions, visit our website at www.greatdecisions.org. To order a copy of the Great Decisions Briefing Book, a DVD set of this series, or to join a Great Decisions discussion group in your area, contact the Foreign Policy Association. Funding for Great Decisions is provided by the Star Foundation and U.S. Trust.